So, to get us into our conversation that we're going to have and an opportunity to do some reacting to a video momentarily that's focusing on assessment and accountability. We've been talking about these two conceps. We're going to continue to have a deeper dialogue with folks who hold some significant, important expertise that can help give us more context. I'm going to do some introductions. So to my furthest left, we have Ray Hart, not Dr. Ray Hart. He's an executive director of the Council of Great City Schools. Thank you so much for being here, Ray. To his immediate right, we have Dr. Ashley L. White, who is a fellow in Equity, Access, and Opportunity Center for Prosperity at the Center for Prosperity Strategy at the NAACP. So thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you being here. Thank you. And finally, we have Dr. Felton Moss, who's a senior professional lecturer at American University. I know there's other things that are parts of your titles. I've read your bios. They're incredible. Thank you for being here. So as an audience, what you should know is that we're going to do some quick introductions, and we're going to pivot immediately into a short video. And this is what's going to happen for the next two panels. We're going to get a chance to watch the video, which is going to be illuminating, bringing some student voices, some constituent voices into the space, and then we're going to give us an opportunity to react to those in real time. So they don't know exactly what the questions are going to be, but they're going to get a chance to answer them nevertheless. So I'm going to turn it to our production team to get us moving into that first video, and then we'll come back and we'll have a chance to talk.
The food quality, cause that's a big one, because a lot of kids need energy to get through the day and stuff. There's a lot of things you could factor in. The race of the teachers, sometimes that plays a big part of how the kids interact with them and stuff.
Just the whole entire faculty and staff, specifically on that, how committed they are to making sure the students do well on their tests. Everyone, no matter how smart they are, everyone should be good.
By the way they treat their students and their faculty, and the way they handle the problems, the issues, because not every school is perfect. Every school has its problems and issues.
Yes, I feel like our state standardized tests do have a good measurement of everything I learned throughout the year.
I think they are a good measurement of what I know. I say that because the questions on there are related to what I've learned throughout the school year, always, and they properly gauge what I know because, they're related to what I've learned. So it's a good test and it helps gauge what I know.
I bombed it, because first it's a 3-hour long test and with bare to minimum breaks, and I most definitely do get test anxiety knowing that it is such a big test, and people have the tendency to be this test may determine what school you could get into, or may center around if you're going to be successful, which I most definitely want to be, and it's kind of putting a lot of pressure on me. If I don't do good on this test, you're not going to be successful.
All right. Thank y'all for listening. So we had some very direct, specific questions asked of young people, giving them an opportunity to offer their insights, which may align with our own, which may be different than our own. And we're going to give a chance for this, for all three of you to respond. So I'm going to start to my immediate left and just start with this question that was the first one that was presented to the students was, what should a school be rated on? What should a school be rated on?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and it makes me think about a broader definition of assessment. I think we've talked about assessment in a very narrow sense in this country since a nation at risk, and it has often been relative to standardized assessments. I'd like to see a broader definition of assessments in a sense that we think about, as the student said, the diversity of the educator workforce in that building. I think what I classify this as is this term called opportunity to learn. So often we produce accountability results and we only measure things like math, reading, and science, but we're not really measuring what opportunities exist in that community. So how much funding is actually in that space. So we really need a broader definition of assessments to really understand what opportunities exist for students to be able to learn in a community. You've heard a lot about social emotional learning in this space, the way in which teachers and leaders are serving students and meeting their social and emotional health. And so I believe those things are important. Now, the student mentioned in the video school lunch. I'm thinking about my time. I would have loved to have done an assessment on our school lunch. The grilled cheese and soup was great. Some of the other stuff was not so great. But I think we really have to have a broader definition of assessment. And I'll end this by saying this. I fundamentally believe assessment is concerned with allocation of resources. And so if assessment is about allocation of resources, then we certainly need a broader definition so we can ensure that we're directing resources to the right folks.
Thank you. Dr. White?
So I will second that about the school lunch. In all of my 15 years of teaching, I never ate it. My mom packed my lunch because my kids didn't like it and I didn't like it either. And so oftentimes I would provide alternative forms of lunch for my students. But to answer the question, I think we should be thinking about what students know. But when we envision assessment, we have to envision it much in the same way that good teachers teach. And what I learned in my time as an educator in the classroom is that there are fundamental concepts that are used when we witness student growth, when we witness student proficiency. And those are concepts like progress monitoring, evidence-based practices, and somehow that gets lost in traditional standardized assessments. Something else that I think would be important to consider is how our teachers are faring, right? Our teachers are the stewards of the educational experiences that our children are receiving. And oftentimes, you can tell how students are learning in the affect of those that are teaching them. I can also say that in terms of assessments, while they do have their place, I taught in a school where we were constantly a D or an F, right? I taught in a school where my teachers also could teach rings around any teacher at the A school across town. We would put our teachers up against their teachers any day of the week. But unfortunately, that didn't show up in our school grade. It didn't show up in student gains. And one of the reasons is because we don't have variability in the way that we assess students. So it's not so much about standardized assessments as is broadening that perspective and creating holistic assessments in the way that we think about good teaching.
Right.
I think that to answer your question, particularly about accountability and how we should judge schools, et cetera, I think our accountability system, as we've developed it, has really taken us down a path of really solving the wrong problem. Because one of the things that we've done is we've said schools are good or bad. Schools are successes or failures. But when you actually look at the data, one of the things that we analyze quite a bit is the data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And 27 of our urban districts, I represent 77 of the nation's largest urban school districts, 27 of them volunteer for the TUTA program, which is a trial urban district program. But when you look at the performance of the students across school type, doesn't matter, charter schools, public school systems, if you look at students who are in poverty, they perform the same no matter what school they attend. Private schools are the exact same. There's actually research studies that show that students who randomly received vouchers to go to private schools, and when you compare those students to students who remained in their public school system, the private schools actually had a negative effect on their math and reading achievement. And one of the things that we've done is we've solved the problem, or trying to solve the problem of good and bad schools. But one of the things that we recognize as a report on our website is called Mirrors or Windows. And in that report, we actually analyzed what we called educational torque, which is what was just mentioned a moment ago about putting our teachers up against others. And we looked at large city school districts versus everyone else. And what we saw in that report was that our districts significantly outperformed the rest of the nation when you control for the types of students who were in the building. The other thing that we noticed is that when we actually look at, and this is in research that we've done, but when you actually look at the performance of students in poverty, so if you look at African-American students in poverty in large urban school districts compared to African-American students in poverty in suburban schools, private schools, we significantly outperform them in their achievement. Now, to be sure, we have a lot of work to be done in our school districts to make sure our schools have an equitable education. But I think the real issue is, what does it take in this nation? What type of investment, which was shared earlier, does it take to change achievement for students who are from our traditionally marginalized communities? We've known for years that IDEA is underfunded for students with special education, but we haven't funded it. And the funding that we've just gotten with the American Rescue Plan funds, that's the funding that education should have been receiving all along. You know, we've acted like it's a great windfall of money, but we should have been making those investments in education all along. It shouldn't be a short-term, one-time deal. And we're already proving in our districts, and I apologize for being long-winded in my answer, but we're already proving in our districts, in Dallas, in other places, in Dallas ISD, for example, African-American students are now already outperforming where they were pre-pandemic. In Birmingham Public Schools, this year, students scored 9 percentage points in third grade math, 5 percentage points better in math than they did a year ago at this time. So what it shows is that investments in our students and investments in our kids makes a difference in their educational outcomes. I'll talk more about our communities overall in a moment, but those investments make a difference, and those are some of the things that we really need to look at, is how are we investing in kids, and what does it take to really move the needle on student achievement for our traditionally marginalized communities.
I mean, just as a quick reaction, and I'm sure a number of you all saw the headline last week around, student assessment scores and the sort of really what it seemed to be pretty daunting, like losses, if you will. And it seems like you're presenting something that is actually counter to that story. I'm not sure if I've read that anywhere else. Like, I guess my question is, why is that? Why are we not seeing more of that story? Why is that not being lifted up? Is it maybe I'm just missing it? But I'm imagining you saw the headlines last week, and I'm imagining you were like, well, there's a more complex story, a nuanced story here. And so I just wanted to present that back to you, knowing that there's a larger meta-narrative happening out there, but you have some different data that's showing you something different. Is there something that we're missing here in terms of how we're talking about it that is not allowing the information that which you're experiencing to kind of become more of a national story, if you will?
I think it's one of the things that we talk about. We share the stories of our districts, our district performance with the Department of Ed, with others. So just trying to get that narrative out there. I think one of the things that was in one of the previous slides was really talking about the counter narrative and that narrative of what's prevalent in the community. But when you really dig deep and you really look underneath things, what you see is that our teachers, and I speak for our large urban school districts, but our teachers and our administrators are changing lives every day. There was a discussion a little earlier about really looking at kindergarten. And I'm not a proponent of kindergarten, but I think kindergarten is one of the most important aspects of our assessment, and where we really need to understand how to invest in kids and where we need to invest in kids to really turn the narrative around. But if we looked at kindergarten and we looked at the growth of kids between kindergarten, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, I'll use Chicago as an example. One of the greatest, there's a study by Sean Reardon that showed that one of the greatest impacts on student growth in the nation is the Chicago public schools. Between 4th and 8th grade, their kids grow more than almost all other students in the nation. But it's a narrative that you don't hear. It's the narrative that's not prevalent in the community. And so that is the narrative that we try to share. That's the data that we try to analyze.
Thank you. So there's a communications opportunity here. I'm going to come back to you, Dr. White, and just start with the second question. As we saw with the students, there were 2 questions they responded to. So we talked about the first one about what they should be rated on, and I'm sure there's more to discuss around that. But then there's a question around standardized tests in general, and there were a variety of responses we heard young people present. So the question I'm going to present back to you is, do you think standardized tests are or can be a good measurement of what young people know and can do?
Before I answer that, something I forgot to do for those in the disability community who may be watching, I am wearing a cream shirt and black pants. So I wanted to make sure I do that. I forget sometimes. But to answer your question, I think standardized tests, in the term standard, could be useful, right? I think, though, the version of standardized assessments that we have now can be and has been extremely harmful. And I'll tell you why. Much like other standardized assessments in the field of teaching, whether that be IQ tests, whether that be college entrance exams, whether that be even licensure exams for teachers, are rooted in what I like to think of as the guise of objectivity, right? And when we think about reliability and validity, are they reliable? Are they valid? Yes, they are. But the question is, in what context? What historical context are they reliable? And in what historical context are they valid? And I would argue, much as what was intimated in the presentation of findings, that there is an essence of overt, actually, racism, right? Ableism that functions through these assessments. So in thinking about standardized, we have to think about that term separate from the standardized assessments that we know now. I would also encourage us to think about the history of when standardized assessments came to be. Much like other assessments in the teaching field, this occurred circa Brown v. Board of Education, right? And so as an intentional attack against efforts to desegregate students. And so we have to think about these things when asking ourselves, can they be useful? We have to think about that in the context, historical and present context, right? And so those are two things I would just like to lift up. I think there are many ways of measuring students that are standardized, that are happening in classrooms already, right? As a teacher, I can tell you all of the times and all of the ways that I was able to standardly measure my students in terms of that was mentioned as well, thinking about where are they and what is the next level up, right? That is happening. It's just that we're not tapping into that in the way that we need to be to create equitable outcomes for students and to measure student growth in the way that it should be. That is one of the reasons why every year my school came up as a D or F, despite the gains that were made, despite the growth, is because of the way that we were conceptualizing this term, standardized assessments.
I see you nodding, so I'm gonna have you build on that.
Yeah, so much powerful stuff said in that statement. You know, this is where I start with this conversation around standardized testing. I was a school principal, I was a school teacher, I worked at the Department of Education, and one of the issues what I have with this conversation around standardized testing is if the standard centers whiteness, it's where I begin to struggle in the beginning. And so if the standard centers whiteness and then there's no deliberate attempt to decenter whiteness in assessments, then I struggle with that. I think the second place that I struggle in this conversation with standardized testing, and then I'll tell you what I really believe and how I reconcile that difference, is when we take standardized testing and it becomes high stakes testing, right? When we begin to make all of our decisions about schools and who they will become. Fact of the matter is, when you give a kid a test at the end of the academic year, and then you give a school a letter grade at the end of the academic year, that sends signals about that community. It sends signals about the teachers in that building. It sends signals about the young folk that are in that building. And so I have problems with that. And so it's when standardized testing centers whiteness, it's when it becomes high-stake testing that I struggle. Where I reconcile the need for a set of assessments is this notion that if we did not have assessments, we would not know who's learning. And the flip side of that is we wouldn't know who's not learning, we wouldn't know who is learning. And so I sit in this position where we have a lot of work to do in this country to really reconcile assessments, because we certainly need to know who isn't learning in this country. We know who is learning, right? Fact of the matter is we know who it is. But I think standardized tests have their place in our society. I just struggle with the standard. And this goes to my thoughts around validity of assessments. Yes, in a sense, these assessments are valid, but they're valid because, again, we're centering whiteness. So in what ways are the items on this assessment able to measure the lived experiences of students and families of color across our country? And so I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of understanding the place that standardized assessments have in this country. And if we're going to continue to advance policy, we've got to stop for a moment and ask ourselves, what are we centering? And I mean that. And Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley says this, and I love it. She says, those that are impacted by the pain the most need to be close to the power. And so why I'm using that quote is that in our decision making about whether or not we want to use these assessments, we need to bring folks to the conversation that have been pained in this work. That's young folks, that's Black folk, that's students who are not able in our situation. So I struggle with this, but I think we need these guardrails so that we can get resources to the right place. But this country is not using assessments to direct resources right now. We're using assessments to give labels like probation, which sounds like the school to prison pipeline to me.
So I want to come back to a couple of the concepts that you've raised, but I also want to make sure I want to hear from all of you on this question. So if you want me to repeat the question, I'll be happy to do so. But it is that question around are they these standardized assessments a good measurement of what students know and can do? Like maybe you can respond to it as currently constituted or as a general idea of what testing could potentially be.
So my background is, and my doctoral degree is in psychometrics and test development and all that wonderful stuff. So I would love nothing more than to put you all to sleep and tell you everything about reliability and validity and standardized assessments and what they are and what it all means. But I think the more important thing is, for example, many people in the community don't know a lot about how the tests are developed. They don't know a lot about, they have perceptions about how they're developed, but don't know in reality. And we talked about reliability and validity from the standpoint of whiteness. But I think what it does tell us, and which was shared earlier, is it does tell us where we are. And one of the things that's most important is for our students. I have a student at home, my daughter, who is a special needs student. I have 4 kids, but one's a special needs student. And my wife and I wanted to make sure that she had the same sets of opportunities as her peers as she grew up. She's 22 years old. And as she went through school, she got to high school, they told us she should only take vocational classes. She's not going to ever get an academic diploma. And we made sure that 1, she could perform well on her standardized assessments. 2, that we made sure that they gave her, she actually graduated not with 1 diploma, but with 2, a vocational diploma and an academic diploma, and went on to college. But for all parents who have kids in school, they want to make sure and they want to know that their child can compete with every other child who's graduating across the country. As a parent, that's what I wanted for my daughter. And that's what we want to make sure all of our students know, as you mentioned earlier. It's about what students know and are able to demonstrate that they can do. So from that perspective, I think standardized assessments are important, but I don't think standardized assessments are the issue. I think the major issue, and going back to what I said earlier, even poor students who go to high-achieving schools, those high-achieving schools don't graduate those poor students at a higher rate than any other schools. The low-performing schools that we call low-performing are graduating kids who are poor, who are English language learners, who are students with disabilities at much higher rates than the highest-performing schools in the country. But what it reflects is that we aren't making the investments that we need in those schools for them to be successful. And it's not just the schools, so I mentioned I would come back to this. It's our communities as well. Jackson Public Schools is one of our communities. And in Jackson Public Schools for the last week, they've missed an entire week of school because they don't have good water quality. One of the residents in Jackson said last week, we've been on a boil water alert for 3 months. And she said, quote, you can't boil the lead out of the water. But what we know is the lead in the water makes a difference in terms of our student learning and our student achievement. So when we disinvest or divest from making investments, not just in education, but in our broader community, all of that plays a role in what our students are able to demonstrate that they know and are able to do. So that is the issue we need to fix. And I'll make one additional point and then I'll shut up. And that is last week, 2 weeks ago, in August, there was a report that came out in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, if you're not familiar with the state legislature in Wisconsin, but the state legislature in Wisconsin over the last decade has siphoned $3.9 billion out of education. Wisconsin, based on the revenue that just came in since January plus previous years, now has a $7 billion unexpected surplus, none of which are they reinvesting in schools. So a total of $10 billion in one state that's not being invested in schools and kids that would make us, it makes the difference between what we can and what we can't do with kids. It was we've shown with ARP and other things. So again, I don't know that, yes, do assessments, standardized assessments, that's my background, yes, they do measure what we want to know, but it's not the assessments, it's not how we use them, it's whether or not we're making the investments to ensure that all of our kids can compete.
Thank you. So I wanted to come back, this idea of centering whiteness has come up a couple times, both in the data that's been presented and I think even in this panel thus far. And what I wanted to do is unpack that a little bit with you. I think it's important that we unpack certain terminology, language, and whatever else have you, whether it's accountability. It's been raised to me already today. What do we mean by that? Can you break it down for me a little bit more? In part because we do know that there are folks who have a counter perception, which is that math is not racist ever. Like, that's just math. You can do math, you can't do math. So the question I'm presenting back to you is how, for someone who is struggling to recognize how it is the case that something can center whiteness, especially if we're trying to create shared narratives of a nation, what do you say to that? How do you say that that is a problem and that it exists?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this question, and I'll answer it from a content perspective on the start of it. I taught 10th grade English and 12th grade English in Greenwood, Mississippi. I have a house in Jackson, so I appreciate you saying that before I moved to DC. But I was a Teach for America teacher in Greenwood, Mississippi. Money, Mississippi was a mile and a half down the road. I was teaching English 2, which was a state tested course. Every passage that came out on that state exam, this state exam literally was the gatekeeper for whether or not my students would graduate high school or not. Mind you, the federal guidance does not say that states have to use state testing to determine if a student graduates or not. But I was sitting in my class and I was giving a lecture about Emmett Till. And Emmett Till was accused of whistling at a white woman a mile and a half down the road. And my students in Greenwood had been cycled through a system of schooling that had been focused on standardized assessments, and they did not know their own history and the history of their own people that had happened just a mile and a half down the road from their school. But they were well aware of the history of others, but not their own history. And so the question that I consistently ask about standardized assessments is, where will my students see themselves in these assessments? And I think the failure to allow Black and brown students to see themselves in assessments is the centering of whiteness. It is the application of white idea and white concepts at the expense of Black and brown children not having an experience with their own narratives, their own lives, their own lived experiences. And we have consistently done that. We have consistently rejected our stories. And when I say our, that's Black folk, that's brown folks, that's people that have been racially minoritized in this country. And that's what I mean by centering whiteness in assessments. And I just can't say it enough, is that it bothered me at my core that they have been in schools that were labeled at some point A and B schools, but did not receive an A or B education that affirmed their racial identity, their cultural identity. And so how do we get assessments to a place where it does that? And that's what I mean by the centering of whiteness. I think the second part of what I mean by centering of whiteness is the usability of that, right? As we continue to become a more globalized society, centralization and marginalization happens in this country, where we want to prepare people to do a specific thing so that America can compete and be a world power and be a light on a hill. And so long as we do that, that is centering whiteness, and it does not give way or give space for people to be who they want to become. And so that's what I mean by centering whiteness.
Looking at both of you, I want to be able to contribute to this conversation. Anything that this is thank you.
So the first thing I would say is that when you center whiteness, there are other areas that are also centered in that context, right? And I think we have to also remember that the English language is centered when we center whiteness. able-bodiedness as we normally know it is also centered, right? Able-mindedness is also centered, right? Christianity is also centered. Antiquated gender norms are also centered. So when we talk about centering whiteness, we are talking about a whole host of areas, and all of that fits into that larger context. I think also, I can't help but to reflect on teaching to the test. I remember I was teaching in Florida, Hillsborough County is 7th, 8th largest school district in the nation. And I was reviewing at the time it was not the FSA, it was the FCAT. And we're going over the questions, right? Because we've been mandated to spend half of our school day reviewing the previous year's test, right? And one of the questions was about a kayak. And one of my students said, "Miss White, what's a kayak?" And I thought, I don't actually know. And I'm the teacher, right? So we had to look that up together. Here I am with a bachelor's degree. I've been teaching for a good 5 or 6 years, and I couldn't draw in my mind what a kayak was because it was not an experience that I had had. And I think that kind of adds to this conversation around centering whiteness. The other thing I will say is in answer to your previous question, do standardized tests tell us what students know? Those tests tell us what some students know. And they don't even tell us all of what they know, which is why we need to expand the way that we think about assessing our students, and it should be a continuous, ongoing thing throughout the year. The progress monitoring that teachers are required to do should count in more ways than it does. I think also I can't help but to reflect on the provision in ESSA, the innovative assessment provision. There are currently, I think 7 states are allowed to do this. Last I checked, there were 5 that were doing it. And so I would be curious to learn what the outcomes will be at the end of that pilot project with the levity to create alternative forms of assessments in their states to find out what the outcomes for that will be.
So I think, assessments, standardized assessments in particular, but all assessments, I think, can benefit from growth, from improvement, from continuous improvement, so that we really truly capture what all kids know and can do. But I think at the same time, there's another side to that as well, and it has to do with what we do as individuals. And you mentioned math. I'm biased toward math because of my background. But I went to an all-black African-American high school on the south side of Atlanta. And one of the things that our teachers insisted upon was that even though we were African-American kids in a community outside of Atlanta, they insisted on the fact that we could learn to do math, that we could learn to read. They had a set of expectations for us that we could do more than what we thought we were incapable of. I wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for those teachers' investments in me and what they poured into me because they believed in me. And one of the things that we do to children quite often is we look at children, I've seen it as I've gone around the country, we look at children and we predetermine what they are capable of doing and what they are capable of learning. And we say to kids, you're not capable of learning math. You're not capable of being able to read a passage in a standardized test. And when we tell them that, they start to internalize that. When they internalize that, then they don't perform. But one of the things that we need to do is set high expectations for all the kids that we teach and all the kids that walk through our doors. And when they walk through the doors, don't marginalize them and say, oh, you can't learn, so I'm going to relegate you to a different program. One of the things about the council, our student population is 44% Latino, is 26% African American, and almost 80% of our students are free and reduced price lunch. It's over 70%. In that population, one of the things that we do as we travel around the country is making sure that all of our schools understand and are teaching kids at grade level, teaching them the curriculum that they're supposed to see at the grade level, and then challenging them beyond that. So in the after-school programs and the things they participated in, they get more than what they would have seen. But that's one of the things that we need to make sure we do for children is make sure we recognize that every child can learn math, reading, 2 languages, 3 languages. No matter what we put in front of them, they are able to grasp it. But if we don't have high expectations for them, then the standardized tests are irrelevant because we aren't going to make sure that they're prepared when they step out of our school systems and into the world.
I have one last question before we turn it into the audience, which is that it's an observation that I'm making, and I think a lot of us in this room are making, that there are a number of governors in our country who are redesigning education policy in their states, to put it in a sort of gentle manner. I live in Washington, D.C., and Virginia is nearby, and in more recent months, it was an executive order, I think, that has really kind of taken a lot of people aback because it's presenting a notion that the way to deal with quote unquote teacher shortages is by sort of lowering the threshold for entry. It is the case I think I've most recently learned, even in our roundtables, as a matter of fact, that Arizona is removing a requirement for a four-year degree to even enter the classroom as a teacher. So this is also Florida's and other places is happening, and there may be a number of reasons this is taking place. So putting that aside for a moment, I want to use that as a preface to the question that I want to ask you. And I'm going to start here, and then we'll go there, and we'll kind of end with you. How about that? So if you were to redesign how we hold schools and districts accountable for student learning and development, what changes would you expect to see?
Yeah, I think this is a really hard question, but I think that we have a unique opportunity at some point in this country to really think about the way in which we hold schools accountable. And I want to deal with the word accountable and really holding schools accountable. I don't think we have flexibilities in ESSA, right, that allows states to go out and retool their education system to be able to get results. And this really goes back to my first point around opportunities to learn. I'd like to literally see us have a system by which we hold policymakers accountable so that schools can be accountable. And that sounds very convoluted, but let me tell you what I mean. Like, we are literally asking I was a school principal in a school turnaround school, and we are literally asking teachers and principals to do really, really hard things with systems that do not allow them to do that. We are literally turning out school leaders who are not prepared to deal with assessment systems. So what does that mean? Folks like me who sit at the university, we've got to literally retrain school principals to be prepared to go out and lead these schools in authentic ways. We've got to have policymakers who are sitting in the mayor's office, who are sitting on boards, who understand that we can no longer use property taxes to fund our system, and we'll always have a disequal system when we're using property taxes to do that. So I know your question was around accountability system for schools, but I think we really need to turn our attention to a holistic approach to accountability so that school leaders and teachers and principals and district office folks can really do the hard work. I think when you look at countries, since we love to compare ourselves to other countries, when you look at countries who do this well and who serve their school districts well, they make significant investments, as you spoke of earlier. But there's a sense of accountability for schools doing well. And I asked this question in my class last night: why is economic strength a pillar in affluent communities and not in communities that's not affluent? And if it was a pillar in communities if economic strength is a pillar in communities that are not affluent, then there would be a rush from leadership, from mayors, from governors, and all of those folks to improve the economic standing in that particular community. And so when you talk about accountability, I actually think we need to turn our sights and attention to our elected leaders who create the conditions for us to have really good schools that we can then hold accountable for ensuring that students learn. I hate to flip your question in that way, but I think that's where we need to turn our sights and attention.
That actually came up a lot in our roundtable discussion, so it's great to hear it echo back here in this space as well. I'm gonna bring it down to you, Ray.
So I'll just share two, and I shared them earlier, but I think the first of which is I talked earlier about schools that get A's and schools that get F's, as you shared earlier. The schools that get A's are schools that have very few students with disabilities or very few English language learners, but they should be judged on how they educate their students with disabilities and their English language learners, and not hide from the fact that they can't educate those kids. And so I think from an accountability perspective, create accountability systems about those who have traditionally, or how schools do with their traditionally marginalized students. and then make a judgment about what happens to students in those schools. So if you can't educate a student with special needs, you can't get an A. If you can't educate an English language learner or a student in poverty, you can't get an A. And if you can take that student in poverty from where they are to a much higher level, to degrees, high school diplomas, college, careers, et cetera, you deserve an A, because you have made an investment in that child, you have poured into them, and you've given them far more than what they had walking through the door. And I don't want you to confuse what I'm saying, in that, yes, their families and their parents and their communities have also made an investment in their lives, but it takes that entire community helping to lift that child. So it's not just the school. So take a look at the communities and judge the communities for what they were able to accomplish as well. So that's one. Second is looking at kindergarten, which I talked about earlier, and really, again, taking a look at where we move children as they move through the educational system. Our school districts, particularly our large urban districts, again, are graduating and making sure students are successful in certain ways that we never see, we never observe. And so for us, it's those two things. It's looking at that accountability system that really says, how well are we doing with the students that we serve?
I would argue that, first of all, we don't want to go back to a time where there was no accountability. I think we need to re-envision what we think accountability is, right? But I can't help but to think about No Child Left Behind. And in some of the other spaces where I operate, the contention around divesting, to use your term, from standardized assessments has to do with the way that students with disabilities are counted. And that didn't really happen until No Child Left Behind. And so much in the same way that we situate accountability in that regard, I would argue that we should situate it in the larger context of school climate and the way that we are considering what else is happening in the school. Assessment is just one facet of what happens in our school buildings. So when we situate it in that broader context of what we want students to be, what we want them to know as individuals, as citizens, as people, and use that to help guide the way that we assess and the way that we think about education in general, I think we could really stand to make some gains.
Thank you all. We got some Q&A time. All right, so I see, already. Go ahead, man, get to the mic.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Glenn Gilzine. I'm the CEO of the Central Florida Urban League in the happiest place on earth, Orlando, Florida. But my question is a very unique one because I'm a former school board member from Pinellas County, St. Petersburg, Florida. And also for our Rattlers in the house, I'm a university trustee, former university trustee. My question is, how can we leverage HBCU College of Education to really drive assessments, accountability, and equity?
I didn't hear the end of your question, but I would like to address it if you don't mind. What was the end of it? To what?
How can we leverage the College of Educations at HBCUs to address assessments, accountability, and equity?
So if I may, I didn't use the example of Guilford County School District when I was talking about school districts and their achievement. But one of the things that Guilford County did this past year with their ARP funds, their American Rescue Plan funds, is actually go to North Carolina A&T State University. And they went to North Carolina A&T and said, I want the math and the science and the engineering students. And I'm going to hire you all to come and tutor our students. I'm going to hire you all to come and work with our students. And oh, by the way, I'm also going to try to recruit you to be teachers in our system. But the result of that was that they outperformed the state this past year in their recovery in mathematics on the state exam. They haven't made up the ground from the pandemic, but they outperformed the state. Not only that, their African-American students, their Hispanic students, their economically disadvantaged students, their ELLs, and their special education students all outperformed in terms of that reduction of the impacts of the pandemic, white students in their district. So it proves that if I go and engage those students and make sure that from an HBCU perspective, we are bringing those students into our districts to become teachers, to become educators, and so that our students see, as I think you mentioned earlier, our students see themselves reflected in other students who have been successful, make all difference in the world.
I really appreciate you giving this scenario. So I worked at an HBCU. I was a professor at Tougaloo College. So there you go. And I've got to I've got to make, in the School of Education, I've got to make one more connection. I work for Congresswoman Frederica Wilson as well, of Florida, who leads HBCU work. Let me say this. The research is clear that when Black and brown students have a teacher that shares their racial identity, they're more likely to be successful. That's clear. I think and HBCUs provided the framework or provided Black teachers for us when there were no Black teachers in schools. And so we have to see HBCUs as a central component in diversifying our educator workforce. It is the baseline of being able to do that. And right now, the U.S. Department of Education just released the Hawkins Center of Excellence grants. And oftentimes, our HBCUs don't know about these things or don't have access to the people to be able to apply for that type of funding. And so I think when we talk about achievement this goes for MSIs, right, and HSIs as well, right? These kinds of institutions, we've got to make a significant investment in them because this is the work that they were doing well before now. They've just been under-resourced and underserved in a way and haven't been able to do this work. So I think the way that we support HBCUs in improving Black and brown student achievement and HSIs and MSIs is to invest in those colleges of education. We have the Hawkins Center of Excellence. When President Obama was in office, they authorized the language, but they never funded it. This is the first time we've actually got funding to be able to support schools of education. So I think that is the one way that we can literally support that. And we've got to knock on doors and beat on doors and tell folks that this kind of funding is important so that it can happen. But I can go on and on, so I'll stop here.
Dax, we have a question from our virtual audience. What needs to be done to ensure educators are prepared and have the resources, time, space, support to pivot away from the over-reliance on standardized tests and participate in creating and implementing a variety of high-quality assessments?
You read it one more time?
Long one. So what needs to be done to make sure that educators are prepared and have the resources, time and space to pivot away from over-reliance on standardized tests and to participate in creating and implementing high-quality assessments?
So I'll take that one. I think to Dr. Moss's point, that in large part is a policy-making issue, right? And unfortunately, we don't live in a time where teachers have the agency that they should. And so we have to look to policymakers to help make that adjustment. In terms of producing well-prepared educators, again, to your point, HBCUs prepare more Black educators than any other institution. We have to tap into that. And we also have to re-envision the way that we prepare teachers in our traditional teacher preparation programs to include the very components that we know are essential to create positive learning environments for our students, things that have been discussed today, such as culturally responsive, and might I add, responsible teaching practices, and that we carry that through when they become teachers into their professional development. The other thing is that we have to figure out a way to re-stamp the teaching profession, rethink the way that we as a society, as an American society, view the profession. And I think that is, until we do that, we're not going to draw in the kind of educators that we want, certainly not in numbers and definitely not in quality.
Moving forward.
So Sharif El-Mekki and I were just saying you answered the question that he and I were trying to joggle for to figure out who would ask it. So I'm going to say a lot, but I am going to ask a question. I'm a fourth generation Tuvaluan. Thank you for your time and service at my institution. My mother and I studied English 25 years apart and had the same professor. My grandmother was a 30-year teacher in the state of Ohio. So this is very near and dear to me in various ways. So where'd he go? The guy that was here that asked the question about HBCUs. Again, a lot, but there's a question. I spent nearly 7 years at UNCF building out their K-12 advocacy work. I then moved on to the KIPP Foundation to think about their community engagement work. And now I serve as the CEO of the National Charter Collaborative. I know charter is a four-letter word for far too many people. However, my organization supports Black, Brown, and Indigenous single-site charter school leaders and founders. So my question, in thinking about all that you have said today, which I could stamp and double stamp all of the things that you all have said, I also served as a member of the DC Public Charter School Board, and as an authorizer, recognized that the accountability measures that we have for charter schools in the District of Columbia are not the same as the accountability measures for our traditional public schools. So we have a set of public dollars that are going to schools that are often attacked, although they are doing the very things you said, doing more with less, et cetera. We have this other system that, of course, our mayor, 2 mayors ago, was able to create an accountability measure by having mayoral control. People are trying to dismantle that. And then I hear you talk about what's happening in the state of, what state was that reallocated money and now has a surplus? Wisconsin. We know that, yes, we have to do teacher prep differently. Sharif's work is that. How do we make sure that people of color know that they have to hold their elected officials accountable in a way that will ensure that if we set up the accountability measures, we have teacher pipelines, that we have all the things that we had prior to, not Roe, clearly I'm thinking about being a woman right now as well, Brown versus Board, right? That if we are not thinking about how to hold those people accountable, they're gonna continue to make decisions that throw us off. We look at school boards, people running for office so that they can aspire to another office. You have people that are sitting in seats every day making critical decisions in terms of funding and budgets, but have no connection to the people who look like those of us that are in this room. So what is that, what would you all say in the roles that you serve now? How would you encourage people of color to not only think about the assessment, accountability, and equity that we hold together in the education space, but that outer layer that manages how that money comes to them? What do we need to do on that side? And that's loaded, I'm sorry.
So you mentioned at the onset that you had to acknowledge our privilege in this room to be able to be here. And I think we have to bring those that are not into our spaces. So for example, I started a small group in Madison Metropolitan School District in Madison, Wisconsin, of teachers, some of whom are of color, some of whom are not, right? But it's a policy workshop and teaching them how to advocate with their local, state, and federal policymakers. Why? Because that's something that someone taught me. And so I think to your point, we have to bring them into these privileged spaces.
I just want to continue that same line of thinking. I get a chance to work on the Hill every day in craft policy, right? And there's just not enough of us in the policy making space at a federal level, state level, or local level. And just to go with Dr. White's point here, we've got to continue to bring us into the policy space and make light of these issues and train and retrain. We get lost often in the jargon, in the lexicon, and many times there are laws that are passed that we're not even brought to the table in the beginning stage. There's one of us at the table. And so if each of us in this room brings someone else to the table, whether or not we have to bring a folding chair, right, to the conversation or not, I literally think that we begin to change the narrative in that way. And so, Dr. Armstrong is sitting over here from Allies. We work together on an issue. If I see something, I'm gonna bring them to the table, right? If there's a bill coming up, I'm gonna do that. And we just don't do that enough. Like, we get in the hustle and bustle of our work and we forget to organize. If Ella Baker was here, she would say, organize, organize, organize. And we've just gotta get back to that level of organization.
I think just one other thing to add. We crisscross the country, work with the Council of Great City Schools, and we have a governance division that's a part of the work that we do. So we support both school boards, superintendents, executive staff. Next week, as a matter of fact, I'm gonna spend 3 days, the last 3 days a week and my weekend, working with the school board to really help. And what we're doing is transitioning those who are running for school board. So not just those who are on the school board, we work with them, but those who are running for school board. And we're actually taking them through a weekend workshop to say, if you don't believe in students, and if you don't believe in improving student outcomes for kids, you shouldn't be here. But essentially making sure they understand what good governance looks like, what it means to provide good governance to a school district, and what their responsibility is to the community. Because the community owns our school districts. It's not the superintendent, it's not the school board. Our communities own the school districts. But the school board represents the community. So what does that mean? What does that look like? And how do you make sure you're playing your role in making sure that student outcomes improve? So we're crisscrossing the country to send that message, to share that. But it's making sure, as you shared earlier, if I'm running for school board, I'm running for school board because I really care about kids,
not because you want to run for school.
Not where I'm going to go next.
Thank you so much. And I also just want to, as you do that work, NACSA, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, has their With Communities work. So centering communities and thinking about how authorizers can think about that differently. I would say take a look at that just to overlap how we're thinking about shifting that side of the work and how that could be helpful in the traditional public side.
Will do.
Thank you.
We have one last question. Is it the one or two? There's two last questions.
Thank you. Sharif El-Mekki at the Center for Black Educator Development. Like everything y'all said, resonated deeply, particularly with HBCUs, the work that you said about youth. We have paid teacher apprentices, high school and college, and the opposite of summer slide, what they see, using the Freedom School model, these teacher apprentices are getting gains. One of the things I'm curious about is, and I'm glad you brought up the university educator prep programming. Like, how do we apply pressure? We're talking a lot of accountability, and again, this holistic approach and policymakers and K-12. People are paying tens of thousands of dollars in 4 to 6 years being prepared, and there's very few other industries or spaces where you can come out and most of the people say, "I'm not prepared." And then time and time again, every study, most teachers are coming out and saying they're unprepared, and the group that we don't talk about enough are principals. So we talk about the 3.7 whatever million teachers. The public school principals in this country can all fit in Penn State's football stadiums. And if we can't get 107,000, right, how do we get almost 4 million, right? So I'm really curious, like, how do you all think about the application of accountability and improvement to educator prep program? Again, not just teachers, but educator prep programs. I saw Jose Wilson over here somewhere, right? Like, should he be working with methods? And I'm not trying to give him more work. He's already busy, but okay. He probably knew I was about to, the reward for good work is more work, as they say at Freedom School, right? But like, how do we make sure that there's more connection? Just like 80% of public school teachers are white, probably very similar to educator prep professors. Some of them who've never taught in the schools that we teach in, but they're telling people, this is how you teach. So how, that's a misalignment that will forever undermine all the other work.
Yeah, Sharif, I really appreciate you bringing this to light. I'll tell you one thing that's happening to really understand the size of this issue is a couple of us just requested the Governmental Accountability Office to tell us what is the diversity of the School of Education across the country. So GAO will be coming out with a report that can tell you what the diversity of that looks like. I think the second part of this is we have something called CAPE standards, right? And it talks about program impact. And we don't see enough School of Educations closed for not doing good work. And I know it's a lot for me to say that. I sit in a School of Education, and at AU, an American University, we've made a real commitment to anti-racism at AU in our work. And it's not just something that we say in word, we actually do it in practice. I'm able to sit here as a professor and talk about centering whiteness because I know I ain't gonna get fired tomorrow. Because of the cover that I have, because of the commitment that we've made. So I want to acknowledge the privilege I have in being able to do that in this space. But I think when we talk about teacher preparation and leader preparation, we've got to woefully shift our accepted wisdom about what that actually looks like. When I was at the Department of Education in Mississippi, you know this, we built a teacher residency program to really run in competition to our School of Ed. We said, if you're not going to train Black and brown teachers to go in schools, we'll stand up our own, right? And then we said, oh, we don't want to just stand it up independently. We'll do it in conjunction with you, and then we'll tell you you can't get these dollars unless 70% of your candidates are candidates of color. Then we'll pay for them to be able to go. So I think that we've got to build those types of public-private partnerships, if you will, like we did with the Kellogg Foundation, to be able to retrain teachers and train new teachers to be able to do the work. In terms of leader preparation, we have some programs like New Leaders across the country that are doing a really good job in doing this. We've really got to push the envelope on state policy leaders to really rethink who gets the authority to train principals. Because right now, we've said only schools of education get to do that. And so let's take capitalism. You all say it works. And so let's create a market and allow opportunity for other people to retrain principals to be able to go in schools and do this really good work. And so I think we've just got to, one, use CAPE standards and close schools of education when they're not getting the job done. They have standards that literally say you have to be able to measure the impact of candidates when they graduate. Two, I think we've got to do a better job of creating models that could run in opposition to schools of education until they get it right. I mean, AU, we just brought in a teacher residency program, and we have an undergraduate teacher education program. So I think we have tremendous work to do there, and we have to hold systems accountable at the policy level to be able to do that, because law dictates who has authority over a license. And right now, that's purely schools of education. We've started to do this with teacher education. We've not done it with leader education yet. So I think that's a place to start, and I'll defer here to my colleagues.
I'm actually in the interest of time. Oh, sorry. No. We have one final question.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Michael Watterson, Schott Foundation for Public Education. Real quick, I'm going to ask you to just get a little bit more granular. For parent and community organizations that are working with school leaders to rethink and reimagine early warning indicators and thinking about that connection to assessment and accountability, what would you advise, devoid of jargon and lexicon, what would you advise those parent and community leaders to do, to think about, to talk about when they're engaging with school leaders around rethinking early warning systems?
Can you clarify early warning?
Student success systems, early warning indicators, on-track systems, all those things.
When I think early, I was thinking something else, but yes, thank you.
But that's part of.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have to remember that instead of a deficit perspective, our children come to us knowing a whole lot. And we need to center that when we bring parents and communities to the table, right? We are not, to your earlier point, we are not the gatekeepers of all knowledge. And so if we are going to bring parents and communities and local religious leaders, right, our churches, all of those things into our school spaces, we have to center the knowledge that they have and really be invested in listening to that knowledge and making the changes accordingly. I think to further answer your question, we have to open up space for them to do that, right, in our school day. And we need to also create spaces that are unconventional. What that might look like, for example, when I worked at Potter Elementary, we often had unconventional school conference days for parents that were working or parents that worked at night, right? So not only do we have to bring them to the table, we have to diversify the ways in which they show up, the times in which they show up, so that we can really begin to collect that anecdotal data that we need to make the kind of changes that we need to do.
I think I just got the wrap up sign. All right, and you want to climb over people? But you really want to ask the question. And I'm not, because you and I got history, I'm not going to stop you from asking the question, so please. Test anxiety. Yes.
One of the things that we talk about, and we share this as we go around the country, I talked about our governance work, is we talk about the fact that student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And that's one of the things we share across the country. It's not about the students, it's about the adults who are in that student's life, and it's not just your godson. But what message has your godson been receiving over and over and over and over and over and over for him to get to the third grade and say, I'm afraid of answering questions on a test? And so it's the adults that have been programmed, not your family, I'm not saying that, I'm talking about teachers, I'm talking about principals, I'm talking about everyone. What we need to really think about is what we do to children when we say, again, I use the word I can't do math, or I can't read. We program in them over and over and over again that you can't do. And then I get to a test, and the only thing that's in my mind is that I can't do. And so I think from an adult standpoint, it's the adult behaviors and the little subliminal things that we do to children over and over and over years that really impacts what they do. And it's not until I have a teacher that changes that mindset for me, that helps me have a mindset of, no, I can do. And I embrace this test because I know I can be successful on it. I'm not worried about it. Because my teachers have taught me what I need to know. I can do the work. I'm not worried about it. One of the kids in the video even said it. One of the kids in the video said, no, I don't have a problem with standardized tests because it reflected what I learned in class. I was ready for it. I was prepared for it. I didn't have a problem with it. But again, it's making sure that we send that message to kids, and it's the adults that have sent that message who are in that child's life. And so student outcomes won't change until adult behaviors change to then impact the kids that they're working with.
I just want to ask something here for 30 seconds. So there was an organization in Mississippi called Mississippi First. We were trying to decide what to do with our state's accountability system. They created a study where they studied how much testing was actually happening in school districts. One of the things they found in school districts where testing was used as a celebration of learning, that the dynamics was completely different. Students felt completely differently. So I think, one, we've got to reframe testing to be like this celebration of learning. Like we're literally celebrating what you learned all year. But I think one thing that we have not paid enough attention to in this space is like the over-testing when it comes to progress monitoring and like formative assessments in schools. When I was an English teacher, we had a test every 3rd and 6th and 9 weeks from the district office that modeled the state test. And so that created a lot of anxiety. And so what this report found is across the state is that districts were over progress monitoring. They were over testing students at the 3rd, 6th, and 9-week mark. And this is literally contributing to anxiety with students. So as we endeavor to solve this assessment problem, we've also got to think about, to Sharif's question, how do we retrain district leaders to understand how their practices are contributing to students having lots of anxiety, to teachers actually being burned out? So I think the crux of this issue is we got to understand how much testing is actually happening in schools every day so that they can get ready for this summit of a test at the end of the year. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you.